The United Nations has officially declared a famine in Gaza, marking the first famine declaration in the region and the first in the Middle East. Experts warn that 500,000 people are now facing catastrophic hunger. This grim announcement comes nearly 2 years into the ongoing conflict triggered by Hamas's 7th of October incursion, compounded by severe restrictions on food and humanitarian aid entering Gaza. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights stated that the famine in Gaza results from unlawful restrictions imposed by Israel on aid entry and distribution, with starvation now being used as a weapon of war. According to the Integrated Food Security Phase classification, over 500,000 people in Gaza, including the Gaza city and its surroundings, are now experiencing catastrophic hunger, with conditions expected to further worsen and spread in coming weeks. Families are going days without food, while vulnerable populations such as children and the elderly and the disabled are bearing the greatest burden. Healthcare systems have collapsed under strain. Gaza's health ministry reports that in the past 24 hours alone, 2 more deaths have now been reported due to starvation. This brings the total death from starvation to 273, including 112 children. UN officials describe this famine as a man-made disaster and a moral indictment, emphasizing that it is not merely a lack of food but deliberate collapse of system vital for survival, amid calls for an immediate ceasefire and unfettered humanitarian access. This famine starkly underscores the urgent need for global action to prevent further loss of innocent lives. Meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has condemned UN declaration, calling the report an outright lie. Israeli airstrikes continue to cause heavy casualties in Gaza, with at least 37 people killed in recent strikes. Humanitarian organizations like UNICEF and Doctors Without Borders warn of dire child survival crisis, with widespread starvation and disease amid Israel's ongoing military operations. Since October of 2023, remember, the conflict has resulted in over 62,000 Palestinian deaths and more than 157,000 injuries, while Israel has suffered over 1,100 fatalities and numerous abductions. Joining us on the show is Major General Rajan Kochhar. Also with us is Pathikrit Pine. We'll go to them in just a bit. But first up, take a look at this story.
It's a famine that hits the most vulnerable first.
Famine has been formally declared in parts of Gaza almost 2 years since Israel's invasion, and critically low supplies of fortified milk and special nutritious pastes are exacerbating the food shortages. Aid agencies, malnutrition experts and the United Nations warn. That's endangering already hungry young children. Almost a quarter of Gaza's population faces starvation. The world's main hunger monitor, the IPC, reported on Friday. This is 8-month-old Hatem. Before his mother, Aisha Wahdan, brought him into the Rantisi Children's Hospital in Gaza City, she says she was trying to wean him on herbs because she could not breastfeed him. But without milk, she said, he could never get full and his weight dropped. The Integrated Food Security Phase classification, or IPC, said Gaza City and its surrounding areas were officially suffering from famine and that it would likely spread. It warned that without a ceasefire and immediate large-scale and unimpeded aid, at least 132,000 children under the age of 5 were at risk of death from acute malnutrition through to June next year.
I tried everything because there was no milk substitute. A carton of milk lasts 4 days for a child who is fully weaned. Milk has become expensive, 200 to 50 shekels. No one could buy a carton of milk. It wasn't even available to buy.
The UN's Human Rights Office said the famine was, quote, the direct result of actions taken by the Israeli government and may amount to a war crime. After a global outcry at its...
All right, on your screens just now, what's unfolding is now categorized as famine by the United Nations. Joining us on the show is Pathikrit Pine. Also with us is Major General Rajan Kochhar. Pathikrit, I want to come to you first. What are the precise criteria involved in declaring a famine in your understanding? Because we've been looking at the humanitarian crisis unfolding in Gaza for weeks and months now. And this declaration finally comes at a time when there is a clarion call globally to various countries to come to Gaza's aid.
Well, frankly, Shweta, first of all, I am not pretty much aware of the precise conditions, but it is pretty apparent that there is a massive shortage of food in Gaza region. and people are struggling, and whatever aid is pouring in, there are strong reports that Hamas is appropriating the whole thing for their own cadre and for their own purpose, rather than that of the mass. So there is a crisis that is pretty much visible. We may not need a definition for that, but there are larger questions that United Nations will have to answer, and the sponsors of United Nations will have to answer. For example, the main sponsors of United Nations, who are in Western Europe and United States, they're far more busy in funding the war in Ukraine. They have pledged $400 billion since 2022 to arm Ukraine. I think that is more of a priority of the Western countries than actually ensuring that the issue in Gaza actually gets solved. But it is also a responsibility and a time for introspection for United Nations as to why since 1945 it has never been able to prevent a dispute from taking the shape of a conflict. What has been the role of United Nations in intervening and stopping conflicts? Why is it that United Nations simply toes to the line of what the Western country says? And giving these statements right now, what UN is saying, people may condemn and people may criticize Israel, but it's not going to help. It's pretty clear that there's a strong support for what Israel is doing from the Western backers of United Nations. So I think there is a complete requirement for overhaul of the multilateral institutions and to introspect as to whether United Nations and its peacekeeping forces have ever been able to prevent even conflicts and terror attacks wherever they are stationed. And second, invariably, is who listens to the United Nations today. Third, there are strong allegations of UNRWA when it was present in Gaza, having collusion with Hamas and the terror elements over there. So the problem is today, United Nations is saying that there is a humanitarian crisis, which is true, which is extremely unfortunate. But will it stop the whatever is happening? I don't think anybody is interested in stopping it, because most of the regions of the world, including South Asia, everywhere there are pertinent problems, ranging for decades, which have not been sorted out, and every region is busy with their own problems. Most of the time, people literally don't bother what is happening elsewhere.
I agree, Pathikrit, that there's nothing that UN is doing actively to really stop if there is a humanitarian crisis, and we're seeing visuals of that humanitarian crisis unfolding on our screens almost every day. Major General Rajan Kochar, come to think of it, at this point, I think it's undeniable that there is a blockade and humanitarian aid and access to Gazans is being actively denied. Even if we go by what Pathikrit said, that is that Hamas is holding potentially every possible aid going into Gaza. Can we agree that enough is not being done, enough aid is not reaching people of Gaza?
Shweta, I entirely I agree with you. There is a requirement of 1,000 trucks per day, which are required to feed a population of 20 lakhs. But unfortunately, from the data which is available, I last saw the data, only 167 trucks were allowed by Israel. The question of criteria, it will be interesting to note that the United Nations lays down a criteria for for announcing a famine in an area when 20% of the households face extreme lack of food that leads to acute malnutrition and mortality. And the second criteria is that 30% of the children under 5 suffer from acute malnutrition. So that implies, you see the situation now. If we take a population of 20 lakhs, it means that 4 lakhs of people are starving, malnutrition, and are not getting their food. So now this entire narrative is changing. I'm not going to talk about the United Nations, because United Nations has not been able to enforce anything here, courtesy the United States. It's very apparent here that whatever United Nations tried, it was vetoed by the United States. So where does where does one go in the United Nations rules and protocols when one member of the Security Council can veto anything? So I think it calls for a structural change in the United Nations and the way it actually functions, because presently the structure of the United Nations does not invoke any kind of confidence. Second important aspect is here. This narrative is shifting now. You see, earlier there was a condemnation of Hamas and the Palestinians for what happened on on the 7th of October. But now with this humanitarian crisis coming to play, and one has been hearing this for a couple of months now. It is not that one was waiting for the United Nations to declare it. It was apparently happening before also. Now the narrative is becoming anti-Israel. The sympathy is now being garnered by the Palestinians and indirectly Hamas, and Israel is being projected as a villain in this entire exercise. So I think this is a very strong turnaround which is taking place, and with these images of all these things which we are seeing on your screen, it is being shown to all the countries of the world, and it is a widespread condemnation of the way Israel is strategizing this entire war, because so far almost I think 2 years are going to be completed, and we have not seen the end of Hamas. We have also not seen all the hostages being freed. So where does this lead to? That is the larger question, because no amount of pressure is working on Israel, even if 147 countries in the United Nations out of 193 recognize Palestine. And even if Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Germany are coming forward to say that we'll also recognize the state of Palestine in September, uh, is that going to make a difference? I don't think it is happening, because unless the United States is pressurized, it is made to act to stop this war, because the first and the foremost thing is a ceasefire. Because unless you have a ceasefire, the humanitarian aid, what we are talking about, 1,000 trucks a day, is not going to happen, Shweta. We may be talking on the channels and here, but it is not happening on ground. The people are
I agree.
suffering there.
I agree, Major General. It's not happening on ground, and it needs to happen on ground. So without really getting into the facets of war, Pathikrit Pine, would it be right to say right now that it looks like all rules of war have been broken if an entire race is suffering to the point that it's on brink of being wiped out due to hunger? Because what we're looking at essentially are pictures of children, elderly people dying of starvation, something that I haven't looked at in my living history.
Shweta, you're absolutely right, but it's repetition of history. It was the same way when US invaded Vietnam and the Vietnam War happened. It was the same way when Iraq and Iran fought for 8 years. It has been the same way when the 1971 war happened and Pakistan did unforgivable atrocities in Bangladesh. It has been the same way when 500,000 children died in Iraq because of sanctions by United States and NATO after the Gulf War. Right now, we have forgotten counts of the number of countries which are in war in Africa and the number of people who are dying there, but that doesn't, actually ignite any more emotions. The problem again goes back to one thing. Yes, it is a problem. Yes, it is a crisis. Yes, it is sad. But the problem is, what does United Nations do except for taking the monthly salary? They do nothing. That is where the real problem is. Even when tell me one thing, Israel keeps on saying one thing, that Hamas must give up weapons. Till date, what has United Nations done to actually enforce that? UNRWA, which is the division of United Nations which has been operating in Gaza, was hand in glove with the fighting arm of Hamas, which is Al Qasim Brigade. Under the UNRWA hospital, there were corridors. And then there is another aspect to it, which is equally unfortunate. If you ask any Israeli, they say, if I allow 100 trucks to come in, at least 10 would have weapon systems coming in. What has till date the United Nations peacekeeping forces, wherever they are present in the region, done to stop that? What has United Nations done to actually ensure that that doesn't happen? So I think we have reached a situation where we don't have a solution. That's the real problem. We may say, and I think most people will say, Israel must stop it. But will they stop? Can anyone make them stop? No. Can you make Hamas give up the fight? No. Since 2007, it is the Palestinians who are ruling, who had the right to govern the city of Gaza, the province of Gaza. They could have created a model state But what did they do out of it? They actually created, maybe they were victims, maybe they were under pressure of Hamas to actually continue creating the terror state, arm themselves to continue a protracted war. So if you see the loop of violence that is happening in the Middle East, every few years you have pictures like this. And we have got so used to it that it doesn't evoke any more response, any more reactions, any more emotions. So it goes back to one thing, as General Sir also mentioned, that we need to restructure United Nations. We need reforms in the multilateral institutions as to whether they cater to the requirement of all the countries, including the developing countries and the poor countries, whether they do that or not, or whether they have just become, mouthpiece and caretakers of the Western major powers. As I stated, I reiterate, right now, in the last 3 years, $400 billion has been pledged by the Western European countries and United States in funding the war in Ukraine. How much of that they could have used to prevent all this conflict in Israel, but they would not. So that's where the problem is. Back to you.
All right, so a clear hypocrisy there of the Western countries when it comes to prioritizing the humanitarian crisis that is unfolding in Gaza. About 62,000 people have died, ladies and gentlemen. The number is only going up with each passing day. This is a crisis unfolding at a scale that hasn't been seen before. It's unprecedented, not for the number of people who've died, but for the fact that they're dying of hunger, of starvation each passing day. Before I let the two of you go, Major General, my last question to you: what can the countries do actively to prevent a blockade to humanitarian aid and crisis? Now, Pathikrit was pointing out there are lots of nuances, of course, to it, that Israel believes that there could be weapons being transported, that perhaps this food is also going to be hogged by Hamas militants, their cadres, instead of local people. But how do we build confidence? Because we need to do it urgently now.
Shweta, this is the reality of war. We cannot say that weapons are being smuggled in and we stop, food supplies, because there is a mechanism of checking all these items, and they are being checked at the Rafah crossing, at the Shalom crossing, where the Israeli defense forces are deployed, and certainly they have the mechanism, even if they don't want to involve the UNRWA, they have the mechanisms available to ensure that only the food supplies go in. So I don't really actually go for that argument of few weapons. But most important aspect here is what is the next way actually forward and what the countries can do about it. See, there is now a situation where the humanitarian crisis is driving the political trajectory rather than the battlefield outcomes. Today, what Israel is trying to do is, Israel is trying to box in the entire population of 20 lakhs in a particular area. Almost 70 to 75% of the Gaza has been captured. And what I hear from the statements which are emanating from Israel is they intend to capture 100% Gaza. So if that is going to be the aim of Israel, it is going to lead to more casualties in the days to come. It will lead to less of humanitarian aid actually getting in. So now is the time for the nations, all the nations, to exert pressure on the United States as well as Israel, because internally also there are demonstrations every day in Israel to stop this war. So I think the first and the foremost thing, and especially I would like to bring in the role of nations, the Arab nations, who are a silent spectator to this entire thing. They need to exert more pressure on these powers to be, because after all these Gulf countries have excellent relations with the United States. Almost 12 to 14 military bases are there in their country of the US. So I think there is a need for the US to take a larger decision, a larger step, and stop this bloodshed.
Absolutely. I think it's time for the US, countries in the Middle East, and any country conscientious right now looking at what's happening needs to intervene. We must ensure that the blockade goes away, that there's more aid, humanitarian aid that reaches people of Gaza. They need it. About 100 plus people, children alone, have died of starvation so far. Thank you very much, Pathikrit Pine, Major General, for joining us on the show today.